Well, good evening. It's about time to get started. If you would be opening your Bibles to the book of Ezra chapter 4. Ezra chapter 4, and we're going to begin around verse 4. Ezra chapter 4, verse 4. Jared, would you lead us in a word of prayer to start our class?
Our God and Father, we come before you this evening. Thank you so much that we can gather together midweek, dear Lord, to fellowship, to come to you in prayer, to see how you deal with us through your word, Lord, and how we learn how we should handle ourselves and conduct ourselves from day to day. We thank you so much for the rain that we have received, Lord. We thank you so much for each and every single one here. We ask a special prayer for those, dear Lord, who were able to be here this evening. Please help them to, if they're able to get back to much wanted help as soon as possible. Thank you so much, Brother Josh, and many others, Lord, who lead us in Bible class, the ladies downstairs. Please do them with a recollection on their mind, Lord, so they can convey to us what they have prepared. We thank you so much for your Son, the sacrifice that you made on behalf of each and every single one of us. Be with us as we go throughout this hour. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Well, reviewing what we've seen thus far in chapter 4, the Jews, they began rebuilding the temple there at Jerusalem. They started building on the foundation. And almost as soon as they began their work, their adversaries took notice. And we talked about these adversaries that are being discussed are people who were settled in what formerly had been known as the land of Israel, now had come to be known as the land of Samaria. They really didn't want the Jews coming back. They didn't want them being able to come and to resettle that land. And so they started trying to come up with a plan whereby they could stop that work. The first plan was they went and they tried to infiltrate. They went and they proposed an idea to the Jews. They said, well, let us work with you. Well, more than likely their intention with that was they would get the blessing of the Jews, and then they would go down and do everything in their power to mess up what the Jews were doing, under the guise of being there to help. Well, due to the fact that the Jews recognized that these individuals were not actually on their side, did not have their best interests at heart, but also the fact that Ezra chapter 1, verses 3 through 4, tells us that it was the responsibility of the Jews and the Jews alone to rebuild the temple. And so they denied this request from the people of Samaria to assist in building the temple. Well, as you can imagine, that was not taken well. And so the Samaritans, from that point forward, started to find a plan B. Started to find another way that they could bring this work to a halt. So notice with me verses 4 and 5. It says, the people of the land, this referring to the Samaritans, tried to discourage the people of Judah. They troubled them in building and hired counselors against them to frustrate their purpose all the days of Cyrus, king of Persia, even until the reign of Darius, king of Persia. Well, in this, we see once and for all that their request to assist the Jews was not sincere. Because when they were denied the ability to help, we see that they then turned malevolent. I mean, they went out and started doing everything in their power to try to discourage the Jews, to turn them away from their work, to try to weaken that rebuilding effort. It says that they hired counselors. Some of the sources said that these counselors would have been individuals that essentially went in and mocked and taunted the people. Went in and tried to offer advice on how to do certain things only to see those fall apart. They were doing everything that they could, everything by their own power, to try to bring to a halt this construction process. But we find that they even went so far as to bribe the king. They bribed some of the king's counselors that were there directing the people. And so we see they're slowly going up the ladder, slowly trying to impact more and more people with authority, trying to win them over to their side, win them over to their point of view. And as it says, this is going to continue through the remainder of Cyrus's reign and into Darius's reign. Now, something that we need to take note of, because we're going to see another name as we move forward. There was a king who reigned for just a short period of time between Cyrus and Darius. And a lot of times in the listing of kings, you don't even see this king mentioned, because oftentimes he's viewed more from the standpoint of a governor or a facilitator, but he was known as a king. And history has recorded his name as either Artaxerxes or Xerxes. And we're going to see that name, especially as we get into some of the writings of the prophets during this time. But the people of Samaria, we find they are putting together a well-planned tactic, a well-planned scheme to stop the rebuilding of the temple. They started out trying to harass the Jews at the local level. Well, that didn't work. And so then they start moving up. And eventually they're going to take it all the way to the king. When they find that all of their other efforts are coming to naught, they're going to have one last-ditch effort of trying to persuade the king to stop this construction. Well, eventually, the adversaries saw an opportunity. After Cyrus has moved on, we have a man, and I mentioned Artaxerxes and Xerxes, but interestingly, he also had a third name that he went by. As we see in verse 6, sometimes he is known as Ahasuerus. And sometimes, generally what it is, you have names that coincide with different languages. And so you would come to have people that wore different names based upon what language is being used to refer to that individual. And so in verse 6, notice it says, in the reign of Ahasuerus, in the beginning of his reign, they wrote an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem. So a new king has come to the throne. Most Old Testament scholars believe that this king did not have a knowledge of the agreement that Cyrus had with the Jews to allow them to go back and to rebuild the temple. And so whenever they sent this letter to the king really had nothing to go off of. He didn't have this past knowledge, this past agreement that Cyrus had made. And so whenever he receives this letter, and in this letter, the adversaries, they fill it with lies. They're coming up, to use a modern term, they're coming up with false news, with fake news. And they're sending this off to the king to try to sway him to their position. Well, verse 7 gives us the names of the leaders of these adversaries who sent this letter. But then we find the wording of the letter in verses 11 through 16. And notice in verse 11, King Ahasuerus is now listed as King Artaxerxes. And so this is where, like I said, it can get kind of confusing, but we need to understand this is talking about the same man. To King Artaxerxes, from your servants, the men of the region beyond the river, and so forth, let it be known to the king that the Jews who came up from you have come to us at Jerusalem and are building the rebellious and evil city, and are finishing its walls and repairing the foundations. Let it now be known to the king, if this city is built and the walls are completed, they will not pay tax, tribute, or custom, and the king's treasury will be diminished. Now because we received support from the palace, it was not proper for us to see the king's dishonor. Therefore, we have sent and informed the king, that search may be made in the book of the records of your fathers. And you will find in the book of the records and know that this city is a rebellious city, harmful to kings and provinces, and that they have incited sedition within the city in former times, for which cause this city was destroyed. And we inform the king that if this city is rebuilt and its walls are completed, the result will be that you will have no dominion beyond the river. Well, notice how they started out. O king, we are your humble servants. We're going to support you. We're going to go along with whatever your decision is, but you need to know this. This is information that you need to know about. He said, these people, these Jews that you have allowed to return to Jerusalem, they've come back and they've started rebuilding the walls. Have we seen anything in the text that says that they were rebuilding the walls? No. What were they doing? They were rebuilding the temple. At this point, that was all they were working on, was the temple. And so they said, they've gone back, they're working on these walls, they're laying the foundations of the city, they're trying to get their fortifications built back up so that they can be opposed to you. So that they can withstand Persia. And they claimed that if the Jews were able to rebuild the walls of the city, that they would rebel against the king of Persia, that they would stop paying taxes, and it would greatly hurt the pocketbook of the king. So, king, you don't want this to happen. They then urged the king and said, go back and check your history. Go check your records and see what this city has done in the past. See how rebellious they've been in the past. And king, that's what they're trying to do again. You let them rebuild these walls, the same thing's going to happen as happened before. That's why Babylon destroyed the city in the first place. Folks, you see, this was all a lie. This letter was a lie. Because all we read in Ezra up to this point, as we see here in Ezra 4 and verse 1, was that they were building the temple of the Lord God of Israel. They had no intention at this point of rebuilding the walls. They had no intention of rebelling against Persia. Persia was the ones that let them go home. The king of Persia was the one that was backing them. But we see the enemies of God were pulling no punches. They were doing everything in their power to oppose the will of God. Well, the king receives this letter. And after he reads it and does a little bit of research, the king of Persia sends a response to the enemies of the Jews. And we see this in verses 17 through 22. It says, to Rehum, the commander, to Shimshai the scribe, to the rest of their companions who dwell in Samaria, and to the remainder beyond the river, peace and so forth. The letter which you sent to us has been clearly read before me, and I gave the command, and a search has been made, and it was found that this city in former times has revolted against kings, and rebellion and sedition have been fostered in it. There have also been mighty kings over Israel who have ruled over all the region beyond the river, and tax, tribute, and custom were paid to them. Now give the command to make these men cease, that this city may not be built until the command is given by me. Take heed now that you do not fail to do this. Why should damage increase to the hurt of the kings? So King Artaxerxes, he says, yeah, I read your letter. He said, I sent some people to look at the records. And yes, this city does have a history of being rebellious. Well, of course, in the eyes of the Babylonians who recorded that history, was the city rebellious? Yes. Because you remember, what was it, the last 3 or 4 kings of Israel were actually subservient to Nebuchadnezzar? Nebuchadnezzar was the supreme leader, but he allowed those kings to remain in position. Well, eventually they rebelled against that oversight. So of course the Babylonians are going to say they're rebellious. Well, Artaxerxes is worried about losing his power, losing his control over that land beyond the river, losing the tax revenue. And so he tells these individuals living in Samaria, he says, I'm putting you in charge of bringing this to a halt. Notice he didn't send his military, he didn't send advisors. He sent these people from Samaria. He said, you better go and you better do it quick, because we don't want anything to happen that could damage or hurt the kings in any way. Well, folks, we can learn a great lesson from this. And that is, while we can be forgiven for past sins, that doesn't mean the decisions that we made in the past cannot come back to hurt us in some way in the future. The consequences of bad decisions that we make can be very long-lasting. Well, there's no question that at this time in Judah's history, God was on their side. God was blessing them. But they had just come out of 70 years of bondage as a punishment for their rebellion against God. Well, now we see that the things that they had engaged in the past are now coming back to haunt them. Even though they weren't the same people now as they were then, even though they were serving the king faithfully, the things that that nation had engaged in the past are now coming full circle and are going to cause an imposition. So the king of Persia decides he can't take any chances. No, they weren't rebelling, but he couldn't take the chance that they might. So he orders that all construction is to stop. All construction on the temple. He says that Jerusalem is not to be rebuilt. But then, as I mentioned, he urges these adversaries of the Jews to essentially become the police force. To go to Jerusalem and make sure nobody's working. Make sure nothing is being built, because they could not run the risk of harm coming to Persia. Well, as you can imagine, as soon as these adversaries received this letter from the king, where do you think they went? They made a beeline for Jerusalem. They could not get there fast enough. Notice verses 23 and 24. Now when the copy of King Artaxerxes' letter was read before Rehum, Shimshai the scribe, and their companions, they went up in haste to Jerusalem against the Jews, and by force of arms made them cease. Thus the work of the house of God, which is at Jerusalem, ceased, and it was discontinued until the 2nd year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia. So now the Jews' adversaries now have authority over them. They now have the authority of the king of Persia behind them. And they quickly accomplish what their desire was. The city is no longer being rebuilt. Work on the temple has come to an end. And this delay is going to drag out for some time. We're going to see that it's actually going to drag out for 16 years. So long, in fact, that God has to send a couple of prophets to rouse the people up, to remind them what their purpose was, why they were in Jerusalem in the first place. These prophets come, and using a variety of different messages and different tactics, they send out a message: get up and get back to work. You've waited long enough, you've been idle long enough, get up and get back to work. You know, sometimes a lesson that we can take from this, sometimes opposition can cause us to shut down. Sometimes when we face opposition, rather than deal with that opposition, we just give up. we stop. Even if that means, we stop doing what we know we're supposed to do. Well, that's what happened with these Jews. They were afraid. And even when they were given permission to start working again, they didn't start constructing the temple. And as we go into our next lesson, we're going to see where their attention was focused moving forward from this point. And so these prophets, they had to be sent to stir the people up, to remind them of what God's will was in their life, what they were supposed to be seeking to accomplish. And that was the rebuilding of the temple. Now I encourage you, we're going to look at some of the prophets and some of the messages that took place during this time. They're going to give a much more detailed account than what we see continuing in the book of Ezra. So I encourage you to turn over to the book of Haggai. Haggai chapter 1. So as we saw there at the end of Ezra chapter 4, work has come to an end. They're no longer working on the temple because they're discouraged. And eventually, when a new king comes to power, Darius, he allows them to resume construction. And he does not place any limitations upon them. They can work on whatever they want to work on in Jerusalem. They can work on the temple. They can work on the walls. They can build whatever they want to build. But we find the Jews had moved on. Their minds were no longer upon rebuilding the house of God. They moved on to other projects. They allowed that discouragement to cause the temple, to cause the house of God to lay in ruins for another 16 years. Well, finally, God sends two prophets. The first of those is Haggai. And we're going to spend a couple of weeks looking at the two chapters of Haggai. And then we find God sends Zechariah. And Zechariah really goes much more in depth than what we see in Haggai. So we're going to spend several lessons in the book of Zechariah. But ultimately, both of these men come bearing the same message. Get up, get to work. Rebuild the temple. Well, let's talk a little bit about Haggai. Like many of the prophets, we know very little about this man. But we find that he was significant because the people responded to the prophecies that he brought, and they resumed the construction of the temple. The name Haggai literally means joyous one. And some believe that he may have been one of those older men that we read about in Ezra chapter 3 who wept when they thought about how this new temple was going to pale in comparison to the glory of the former temple. Homer Haley, in his commentary on the Minor Prophets, said this. Says, the writing of Haggai is unlike that of his predecessors. Lacking in his work is the rhythm and the rolling grandeur of Nahum, the poetry and the charm of Habakkuk, or the fire of Amos. In comparison, his work seems subdued and prosaic, but nevertheless, he was successful. The prophet Haggai is a great example that God can take anyone with any background, with any personality, with any education level, and accomplish his will through that person. Haggai was an unlikely messenger, simply because from what we can deduce from the text, he was a more subdued individual. He was very mild-mannered. He didn't have the fiery passion that we think about with a lot of the prophets. But even with that, he was successful. But one thing I appreciate so much about Haggai is in these two chapters, 26 times he emphasizes that he is bringing the word of the Lord. He wants the people to know that this is not a message from him, that this is God speaking through him. And we appreciate that fact. And as we look at these 2 chapters, we find that there are essentially 4 separate prophecies that God delivers to Haggai that he then carries to the people. The first is chapter 1, verses 1 through 15. It says, in the 2nd month of King Darius, in the 6th month, on the 1st day of the month. So this is when this first prophecy is handed down. The second is in Haggai chapter 2, verses 1 through 9. And it takes place in the 7th month, on the 21st day of the month. The third prophecy is Haggai chapter 2, verses 10 through 19. And this takes place on the 24th day of the 9th month in the 2nd year of King Darius. And then the fourth is Haggai chapter 2, verses 20 through 23. And it took place on the same day as the previous prophecy, the 24th day of the 9th month. Well, the Darius that's mentioned in this book, that's a name that we've come across multiple times already. This is the same Darius who was king at the time of Daniel. This is the same Darius that had Daniel cast into the lion's den. This is the same Darius that eventually came to praise God when Daniel was spared from the lions. What this shows us is that even though some of the Jews had left and were now back in Jerusalem, that there were still many Jews who were still back in Babylon. Because Darius was there as the king, we know that Daniel was essentially alive for the whole reign of King Darius. It's believed he passed away about 2 years before the end of Darius's reign. And so you see, and we talked about this quite at length a couple of weeks ago, you still had a very active Jewish community there in Babylon. And so while all of this is taking place, Darius had issued a decree that they could get back to work. They didn't have to sit there and be idle. Cyrus had decreed that they could go back and rebuild the city, so Darius was going to go along with it. You may remember we discussed in a previous lesson the fact that when the Mede and Persian empires consolidated, essentially you had dual kings. You had Cyrus and Darius. Cyrus was the king of Persia. Darius was the king of Mede. And so they essentially were partners together. And so Darius wasn't going to go against Cyrus, and Cyrus wasn't going to go against Darius. And so when Darius came into power, he allowed them to start building once again. But what we're going to find is when they were allowed to start building once again, rather than do what God had instructed them to do and immediately start working on the temple, they started building houses for themselves. They started rebuilding what we might call the infrastructure of the city. And they continued to let the temple lay there in ruins. Well, with all of this, God finally decides that something has to be done. And he sends the first of 2 prophets, a man by the name of Haggai. And Haggai begins by restating the view that the people currently had toward the temple. And that was, they did not believe that the time was right for them to start rebuilding. Folks, they were making an excuse. They wanted to focus on other things. They wanted to build their house. They wanted a nice place for them. They wanted to get that society functioning back. So they made the excuse, well, it's not the right time. Now's not a good time for us to start working on the temple again. So Haggai starts by calling them out for that. Telling them, well, I know this is the mentality that you have. But then essentially he asks them, when is that right time going to begin? You've had 16 years. You would think in 16 years the right time to build would come along. But what had happened was they had developed a complacency and an indifference toward that project. Remember, they had the altar constructed so they could offer their sacrifices. They could celebrate their feasts, so why worry about rebuilding the temple? If we're able to do a lot of the things that we weren't able to do in Babylon, well, we're already a step ahead. So why would we worry about the rest of that building when we're living in tents and shacks? Well, then the word of the Lord came from Haggai. And I want you to listen to this statement and think to yourself, do you sense a bit of sarcasm in this statement? Haggai comes to the people and he says, "Is it time for you yourselves to dwell in paneled houses and this temple to lie in ruins?" So he comes to them and he says, okay, he says, if you're saying it's not the right time, are you saying it is time for you to have a nice house to live in, but God's house to lay here destroyed? Is that the kind of reasoning that you're using? So Haggai, essentially, he responds to him. He says, is it time for you to build and live in these nice opulent houses that you're building? And when it talks about building paneled houses, many people believe that what they were actually doing was taking some of the materials that Cyrus had given them for the construction of the temple and were building their own houses rather than building the house of God. Because you go back and you remember the descriptions that were given of when Solomon's temple, the temple in Solomon's day was being built. It talks about the paneled walls, the wood paneled walls made out of from the cedars of Lebanon, these very opulent structures. Also, we see it describing the construction of David's palace, the king's palace. It's described as being constructed with paneled walls. The only kind of structures that we ever read about in the Bible, other than the houses that people were building in Jerusalem, were those that were either in the temple or they were in the homes of royalty. And so rather than focus upon building the house of God back the way that it needed to be, they were taking many of those materials, those precious materials, and putting them into their own homes. Can you see why God would be a little frustrated with that? So Haggai, he warns the people, and this is where we're going to stop for tonight. He starts out by warning the people. He says, consider your ways. You know, sometimes I think it's important that we simply stop and reflect upon the way we're doing things. Consider your ways. We're going to stop right there. Lord willing, next Wednesday night we'll pick up at verse 5.